The Gulf Injustice Podcast, the official podcast of Detained in Dubai with Radha Stirling.
Welcome, Mr. Slaughter, to the Gulf Injustice Podcast. We're delighted to have you here today, but unfortunately we're talking about a case of human rights violations in the UAE, and that is Albert Douglas. He's been detained in Dubai for the past several months, allegedly because of his involvement with his son's business. His son's business had failed due to debt reasons, and his son was in the United Kingdom. So instead of seeking retribution through the son, and of course he wasn't a criminal by any means, debt is criminalised in the UAE, but they decided to hold his father instead. And this is quite a common issue in the UAE. We've had another British national, Morag Koussa, who was released last year, but she'd been held for several years because of her former husband's debt with the bank. So this is a regular occurrence. The fact is, we've had the British courts here rule that they won't extradite anyone to the UAE based on human rights violations, torture, unfair trials and discrimination. And yet what we're seeing is the FCO is not at all reflecting the judgments of the court by increasing their travel warnings, which would perhaps change the minds of British nationals who might seek to invest or do business in the UAE because it puts their lives at risk. Now, I understand that you recently suggested some increase to the travel warnings, and it's something that has been broached in the past. Do you think that that would be a good idea? Would it perhaps influence the UAE to change certain behaviours or increase fair trials, improve things overall?
Well, thanks for asking me to contribute and comment on Albert Douglas's case, which is extremely concerning. It's obviously particularly for him and for his family, but it does raise a lot of the ongoing concerns which we have about the legal system and due process in the UAE, particularly this case because of that business link. Now, all these things that you've talked about would be anathema to the British courts. The idea that the criminalisation of debt, as you say, holding people as proxy for debts, whether they're due or not, and I think that perhaps brings home quite clearly, and it should bring home to the FCDO as well, the fact that we are not dealing with a regime here which adheres to the normal standards of justice, and therefore we ought to be concerned about that, both in terms of general human rights terms, but also in terms of business.
Absolutely. And the other thing that we've been trying to work with the FCO on is simply getting Albert his medication. Now, when he was arrested, he asked for his life-saving heart medication that he was dependent on. And when he asked for his medication, he was beaten by the prison guards and told not to ask for it again. And he's been too afraid to since. So he's relied on the FCDO to get involved and ensure that he has his heart medication. But the FCO returned to Wolfgang Douglas, his son, and told him that they had given him his heart medication in June, which turned out to be absolutely false. And nothing has still been done to ensure that he gets that heart medication. And we've been told by Dominic Raab on this issue that he has the ability, or the UK government has the ability, to get involved, to talk to their counterparts in the UAE about specific cases of human rights abuses and unfair trials. But they haven't seemed to have done that in this case, because it seems the British government should at least be able to get someone life-saving medication. But months have passed now and nothing's happened on that level. This is as far as we have dealt with so many cases in the UAE, and most people have come back with the same complaints, that the FCO is doing absolutely nothing. Do you think that's because of trade deals and the various mutual business interests that are going on?
Well, I think what you just said raises two separate serious issues of concern. The first is the general level of human rights abuse in the UAE. And there have been many stories, often of UAE nationals who take a position in terms of political things that you would think are perfectly normal in the UK, but who are locked up, mistreated, tortured, etc. The fact that this now happens also to foreign nationals, UK nationals such as Albert Douglas, and he is not the first, is something that should really worry the government here very much. They should be worried about the general human rights record of the UAE. They should particularly be worried when it affects UK citizens. But I'm afraid what it also reflects is quite often what is a poor level of consular assistance, not just confined to the UAE either. I can only conjecture as to why that is, whether it's to do with resources, whether it's to do with policy, whether it is to do with turning a blind eye. I'm as sure as I can be in relation to the UAE and some other so-called friendly countries in the Gulf, that there is engagement even on justice matters, even on the matters where these abuses are occurring, i.e. assistance or cover given by the UK government. And therefore, it's very difficult not to conclude that a blind eye is being turned because of the advantages. It could be trade and commerce, it could be defence, it could be other relations between the two governments. But that should not trump the rights of the individual citizen, particularly something as basic as medical treatment.
Yes, I would agree with that. But certainly since Brexit, we've been more reliant on the UAE as far as investment coming into our country. And the UAE has just committed to invest a significant amount into a variety of sectors in the UK. And that's on top of their already large contributions. And that's to real estate, to businesses, to healthcare. And it seems to only be increasing our universities, education. And it seems like we're creating a very, very strong alliance with the UAE, but we're not asking for those protections for our citizens when they go abroad, and we're not advocating that for them when they get into trouble. The standard response seems to be to advise the British nationals who have experienced troubles in the UAE, whether they're human rights violations, unfair trials, wrongful detentions, or arrests without charge, lengthy detentions without charge. All we seem to be telling them is to go and hire a local lawyer, but often that doesn't provide the solution because the system has been exposed for being quite corrupt. Then there is still issues with corruption in the judicial system, in the enforcement system. So simply advising people to hire a local lawyer is not a solution. I think if we see that there is an obvious case where someone has been denied due process, a fair trial, and they have been clearly persecuted, as in Albert Douglas's case, we have to step in as a government and say that, okay, our relationship is good on the levels of security, trade, commerce. We're each marketing each other, and it is a good relationship overall, but it cannot be at the expense of British citizens. And that needs to be made, I think, a lot more clear. We've had Lee Bradley Brown, a British national who was killed in custody. An inquiry from the UK was opened into that particular case, but the UAE authorities wouldn't cooperate. They wouldn't hand over CCTV evidence of the prison or anything like that. So that was sort of an unsolved mystery in the end, although there were several British eyewitnesses who said that he was beaten to death. Then after that, we've still had a number of allegations of torture and human rights abuses, a number of United Nations applications, and we have lawsuits going on in the UK about torture that's happening to British citizens after the death of Lee Bradley Brown. So the fact that we haven't intervened in these cases in the past, as you said, I feel like it is giving that green light to the UAE to go ahead and do whatever they want. And if we don't sort of put in those boundaries, we're going to see a lot more British nationals abused over there.
I think you make a good point about Brexit, which is not to say that there hasn't been a growing relationship between the UK and the UAE over many years before Brexit, and a lot of the type of behaviour that you've spoken about happened before that time. I think the difference that Brexit has made is that it's made us more reliant now and in the future on forming trading partnerships which compensate in some way for the loss of the relationship with our main trading partner. And on the whole, those are going to be countries that have worse human rights records. And that's not just UAE, even in the Gulf, Bahrain, and Saudi, and so on. But that does seem to be the way that we are drifting, or it may be a matter of specific policy that's just not made explicit. And so whereas what we should be doing is defending the rights of UK citizens abroad. That is the job of the Foreign Office. And it's also the job of the Foreign Office and the government more generally to take a stand on human rights internationally, and that's something which Britain traditionally has done. And we produce reports every year indicating human rights abuses, including in the Gulf, including in the UAE. But that is not honoured in the execution. And what we're seeing now, as you set out, is in a number of different cases that effectively legal rights have been withdrawn from individuals within the Bahraini justice and prison system, and the UK is doing little or nothing to protest against that. And the obvious question is, if we have this good relationship with the UAE, if we are trading not just in ordinary commercial goods, but in information, in security, in armaments and things of that kind, why are we not using that relationship to put pressure on the UAE, especially in terms of UK nationals? It's a scandal, frankly, that isn't being done. And I'm afraid that Albert and his family are currently suffering from that approach.
Certainly. I mean, what I've seen over the past 10 years is also other foreign governments and how they have resolved situations for their citizens. And what I would say about the UK is that they are a little bit low on the ladder as far as advocating for their citizens. When I see the United States Department of US State Department getting involved, the US Embassy actively getting involved and resolving cases for their citizens very quickly. And then Canada also, in a very complicated case, went above and beyond what you would expect from the government to help their citizen home, and they succeeded. Then we even had Malaysia send their foreign minister over to speak with their counterparts in the UAE directly on a single case of a Malaysian detained there unfairly, and he was able to bring him home. And yet more and more I see the UK FCDO completely backing off, and it's only really when MPs and the media sort of activate and put a lot of pressure do they actually come forward and do something. But if there isn't that sort of support behind a case, they tend to completely fob it off, which is disappointing in the sense that it's going to create more and more of the same problem over and over again. And it does put lives at risk when we're talking about the kind of torture that has been reported back. What do you think is, I mean, how do you think that the MPs who are representing their constituents in these situations, what do you think they should do? I've seen Kenny McCaskill, for example, take matters into his own hands and skip over the FCDO entirely, contacting the Greek authorities to resolve a case for his constituent. I've seen Priti Patel, even with Asa Hutchinson, go directly to the UAE and speak about their particular case. But other than that, MPs who tend to take it straight to the FCO will also get, in a sense, rejected, as would any person going there. They get the standard letter back that says, tell them we can't intervene, where we know they actually can intervene, and they have intervened in other cases like Matthew Hedges.
Well, we know there are a number of different ways in which MPs can help. They can obviously help by raising the matter in Parliament, in debates and questions and so on, either as individuals or through mechanisms like all-party groups. And so, for example, in Albert Douglas' case, I'm a member of the all-party group for democracy in the Gulf, and also a vice chair of the all-party group for Gypsies, Trouble and Roma. And because Albert is of Gypsy heritage, there's a big campaign from the community there. So there are ways of raising, if you like, through the media, through Parliament, and so on and so forth. In terms of what the individual MP does, either directly or in relation to the foreign government, the primary responsibility rests with the constituency MP. So I have, in the case, had one or two quite famous cases, for example, in Iran, with individual constituents who have been detained, imprisoned, or in some way persecuted there. And any MP will have a number of these cases to different levels with different types of regime over time. And whereas it is potentially possible to raise these things directly if you're dealing with a reasonable government, so Greece might be an example of that, or then it's still not always going to get you a strong response because effectively you're going around what the normal routes are. It's very unlikely to get an active response from a country like the UAE, particularly if the MP concerned it comes from a background of pointing out the human rights abuses in the UAE. So from that point of view, you often are driven back to the Foreign Office. And frankly, that's right, because it shouldn't be the case of 650 independent agents who have no status other than being elected in the UK, which means nothing to a foreign government. It is the responsibility of government to do this, and the government should not be let off the hook. The next problem is that the Foreign Office will often only deal with the MP of either the family, or if the person concerned is normally resident in the UK, wherever they're normally resident. In the case of the MP for Kensington. Generally speaking, there is a convention that ministers, and I've done this myself on a number of occasions, Foreign Office ministers will meet and discuss that case with the constituency MP, but only with the constituency MP. And that is a good thing to do, and a way of putting pressure on getting information out. I agree with you that the Foreign Office often drags its feet for some of the reasons I've already given, and I think that is particularly problematic where it's a regime which, putting it crudely, the UK government wants to be on good or better terms and sees commercial or other advantages in doing that. But none of that should matter. At the end of the day, the primary responsibility is to the UK, to the safety and welfare of UK citizens in this country and abroad. And that's why it's scandalous that cases like Albert are not being pursued, because as you say, we know the Foreign Office can do, has done in other cases, and we know that other governments have done that with a successful result in relation to the UAE. There should not be any barriers to resolving this case, particularly if the basis for detention is so flimsy.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that assessment. I mean, the UAE has in the past been very, very open, surprisingly, perhaps even more so than European countries who deal with things in a different way. The UAE government and the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum, has direct access to resolve any issue of unfairness in the legal system. He can immediately pardon someone. He can order their release. He can order a retrial, an investigation. It's not like the UK in that it's a completely separate judiciary. They have the ability to intervene in cases there. So when the Foreign Office writes back and says that they wouldn't interfere in a foreign legal system and they wouldn't expect a foreign government to try to do the same with theirs, it's a much different situation when you're dealing with countries who have the direct ability to intervene in a case where they can see that there has clearly been a violation of human rights or an unfair trial or a wrongful persecution or prosecution. And we've actually seen this in several cases where Sheikh Mohammed has intervened in British nationals having been detained abroad. But usually that's the result of media pressure. In a case like this, it's a little bit more complicated. The media kind of combined with that sort of extra push from the government will usually resolve in that person's release, as we saw with the Canadians and Andre Gautier this year. So there is that avenue, and certainly we'll keep up the pressure. Thank you very much for your time and your ongoing support for Albert Douglas. You have been absolutely amazing and really achieved, I think, some good things in that the UAE has responded. We've had the UAE ambassador respond. We've had Dominic Raab. It's certainly been raised up the channel, and I'm hoping that that sort of pressure will continue and that will lead to Albert's safe return home.
Thank you for listening to the Gulf in Justice podcast.